Hello there, it's Deborah Irene, and I'm coming to you today for story time. It's been a few weeks, and it's the Christmas season, and I've been telling you stories about my mother, stories and lessons that she taught me. So I want to continue with that today as we're in the Christmas season. You'll notice I've got my Christmas tree up behind me, and I've got a couple of stockings that I made for my boys when they were young. And then you'll also see the Nativity in the back. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you know what? These are things that my mother taught me. She taught me how to enjoy the Christmas season. She came from very humble beginnings as a childhood born in the Depression era. I'm going to read to you just a little bit in a minute about that. But they didn't have much, and they didn't have much for Christmas. They had a big family, and they enjoyed each other, but in terms of a lot of personal gifts and belongings, there just wasn't much back in those days. And so when she had her own family and had moved to California, things were a little bit better for her and my dad. And she wanted to give us as a mother a little bit more than what she had. And she did. But she always taught us, we had fun with Santa Claus. Oh, I'll read to you another piece about that. We played that game too. But there was always faith, and she always taught us about the meaning of Christmas, the true meaning and the birth of Christ, the birth of Jesus. So she had fun with us, and she taught us spiritual lessons as well. And then she passed those things down to me, and I tried to do the same thing with my boys. So let me just read you a couple of little excerpts out of my books. And this is from my mother's book, Helen's Heritage. So this is her voice. And this is just to show you the humble beginnings that she came from. I'm going to start in the middle of a section here. She said, when we were children, we made stilts out of wooden poles. We learned to balance and walk all around on those things. We played kick the can, our version of soccer. I loved to play push the hoop at Lizzie's. I don't know why we called it hoop. It was a cart. We liked to play cards, but weren't allowed to have them in the house. I think it was supposed to be a sin. So we made our cards out of lightweight cardboard. We played books, pig, and old maid. But when we saw Poppy coming, we hid the cards. Occasionally, we received marbles and jacks for Christmas. One time, I remember receiving table tennis at Christmas, one gift for all of us. We were so glad to receive it. We stayed home most of the time, way out in the country, but on Saturdays we went to town like everyone else. Farmers brought their crops to town and sold them, and they, in turn, bought food and supplies. Sometimes Poppy gave us a few pennies to spend, or just bought us a grapette, orangeette, cola or candy bar, or maybe some penny candy. I thought that was terrific. I remember my mother telling me that sometimes all she received at Christmas time was maybe a piece of fruit, like an orange or an apple, in a stocking. So those are very humble beginnings. By the late 50s and 60s, when she was raising her own family in California, I remember some very fun Christmases and driving in the car. So I'm going to read you this little story. Now this is from my book, Reflections. This is my first book where I am talking about my mother and remembering the good things and the fun things that she did. And so here around Christmas time, I say, how could I forget the dish set and little piano that Santa brought that year? Or the time Vicky and I were going to Mammy's to spend the night when you had to work late. You said you were going to buy us a doctor's kit to play with, but you came out of the store with two, not one, so we didn't have to share. And remember the times you would put us in our newly made Christmas pajamas, ready for bed, but then take us to look at the beautiful Christmas lights on Candy Cane Lane? Then there was the time you slowed down as you were approaching a downtown stoplight to let us look at Santa Claus displayed in a store window. As you slowly crossed through the intersection, the light changed and you received a ticket. When the police officer said to hand them over, I thought he meant the kids, so I scrunched down in the floorboard of the car to hide. As always, I was so glad you were there. I found out later that he meant to hand over your driver's license. She made Christmas fun for us. I remember the silver aluminum Christmas tree. You remember those from the 60s? I remember the year she bought that. It was not a real tall one, and she set it on the sewing machine, the top of the sewing machine, and so it could be visible in through the window, and decorated it with lights and glass bulbs. So those were some fun times for me as a child growing up in California. And as I said, she always taught us also about Jesus' birth. That's the real meaning of Christmas. And this nativity set back here, that you see back here, was something that I grew up seeing. She had it on display every Christmas. I didn't understand where it came from when I was a little girl, but it always was. So she was able to tell us the Christmas story from this nativity set. So in my book that I wrote, my latest book, Someday I Will Write, which is a collection of stories and blogs I wrote over a period of about 10 years, I wrote a chapter, and I called this Christmas Traditions. And I wrote this first as a blog in the year 2011, Remembering Christmas. So I tried to carry on some of the same things that my mother taught me. Let me read this to you. I was reading another blog this week, one that I regularly follow, and yes, you guessed it, it prompted a reflection. I enjoy reading her blog because she reminds me of me 20 years ago. So here is my reflection inspired by someone else's blog. One of my Christmas traditions when raising my boys was to select a special family Christmas card. Great care and consideration were placed into selecting the perfect card each year that would be sent to over 100 family members and friends. I wanted it to have meaning and to touch people's hearts. I would include the typical family letter updating everyone on the boys' progress for the year, along with the very standard school photos. Then, after addressing all of the envelopes, I would keep one copy of that card, date it, and turn it into an ornament for our very large Christmas tree. I remember many of the cards, but one stands out as my all-time favorite. And my mother and I talked a lot about the card and the meaning of this card. Christmas, as we know, can be stressful, especially when raising children. You want to give them their heart's desires and sometimes overextend financially. You want to buy that special gift for your spouse or parents and sometimes fear that it may not be what they would have selected. The preparations for that one special day, shopping, baking, cooking, organizing family gatherings, along with attending school programs, office parties, and church programs. It's such a busy time. The card I am remembering put everything into perspective that year. The scene on the front of the card was a modest one, a cozy fire glowing in the small fireplace, a rocking chair to the side. It was not an elaborate room. A little boy was standing facing the fireplace with a teddy bear dragging the floor from the fingertips of his right hand. You couldn't see his face, only the backside of his hair and pajamas. Reminded me as a little girl in my Christmas pajamas. He was peering up to the mantel where a nativity was displayed. He seemed to want to see it all, standing on his tiptoes on the braided rug to get a better view. It was not a photograph, but rather an artist's rendering of a somewhat dated era. The inside of the card read, "When you get right down to it, the only thing that really matters is Jesus." This was indeed the perfect card, not only for that year, but for every year. I remember receiving more comments than usual on the card. The words in this card are timeless, evident in that I found the same words in a card for sale this Christmas, 20 years later. The front design was different, but still involved a nativity scene. I am reminded of another tradition when I walk into my living room and see the nativity set belonging to my grandmother. Growing up, I didn't realize it had been hers. My mother displayed it every Christmas in our living room. I never questioned its origin throughout the years. It simply always was. Then one year, as a young woman in my 20s, I asked my mother what she had done with that nativity set. She responded, "You mean my mother's?" The nativity pieces were in a box in the garage, but the stable had deteriorated and had been thrown away a few years earlier. She then told me this story. She had purchased it for her mother over 40 years ago as a teenager because her mother was a little depressed that year and wasn't going to decorate for Christmas. So the tradition of the nativity began with this gift from my mother to my grandmother. Even though Mammy, my grandmother, that's what I called her, died a few years after that, my mother displayed it every year in her own living room. I humbly asked, "May I have the pieces?" She gave them to me, and I purchased a stable at a crafts store. Like my mother, I displayed it every Christmas in my living room or dining room. The boys grew up with it like I had. It always just was. Now they can know the story, the tradition. Although the boys are grown and the tradition of selecting the family card is a thing of the past, the words in that very special card ring true. Now I worry about finances, college expenses. I worry about their choices and mine. I try to work in all the activities at the office, stay in touch with family and friends through various social media, and maybe I should try to work in that Christmas Eve service too. I still wear my ugly Christmas sweater that's not so ugly to me, and the earrings my youngest son gave me for Christmas about 15 years ago. Hooks with small red and green beads and a Santa dangling at the bottom. You know, maybe it's time for some new traditions, but this one thing I know as I look at my mother's nativity and the thing my mother taught me As I look at my grandmother's nativity and the thing my mother taught me, the only thing that really matters is Jesus. You know, my mother passed away this past September, so this is my first Christmas and my sister's first Christmas without her. And at her memorial service, that's the last thing that we said. The only thing that really matters is Jesus. So I hope you have a nice Christmas, even in the midst of the pandemic that we're still going through. There's still hope, and maybe you need to start some new traditions. It's Deborah Irene coming to you today with story time and lessons and stories my mother taught.